You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I remember the day the census taker walked up my driveway, and I walked down to talk to the gentleman, and no, I didn't eat his liver with some fava beans and that kind of thing. I did answer his questions, but there was a point where I'd answered the questions required by the U.S. Constitution, and I said, that's enough. He said, are you sure? And I said, yeah, I'm absolutely sure. I've given you what the Constitution requires me to give you. I don't want to give any more. Well, you know the U.S. Census is conducted as ordered by the Constitution every 10 years. The same questions, but in 2020, they added questions about sex and gender and a lot of other nonsense. Are they abusing their power? I thought we'd talk about that with Adi Dinar, who's an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. Adi, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Is the Census Bureau invading the privacy of Americans?
I think so. And the way that the Census Bureau is doing this is by doing a survey they're calling the American Community Survey, which is not the decennial census. It is not the census which the Constitution requires them to conduct once every 10 years. The ACS is a separate survey that the Census Bureau is conducting every year, and it is asking about 100 highly intrusive and personal questions on the survey. So, for example, they're asking about the person's sexual orientation, gender identity, fertility history, marital status, divorce history. They're asking about private health information, including medical and psychological conditions. They're even asking about how much taxes and utility bills the household pays. And they're also asking how many beds, cars, and washing machines the household has. And if you refuse to answer, they are threatening Americans with fines of up to $5,000 for refusing to answer.
Adi, did the Congress sign off on them doing this, or is this a decision by bureaucrats?
This is largely a decision by bureaucrats. The Congress has only authorized the Census Bureau to do one job, which is do the census, the actual enumeration, once every 10 years. And the Congress has allowed the Census Bureau to do some statistical adjustments to ensure the accuracy of the census. But the bureaucrats are taking that language in the statute to mean that they can collect any and all information they feel like collecting from Americans, and that is wrong.
Well, and when you say these adjustments, I understand in theory that when they count a particular community, they say, we've figured out that we must have missed a certain number of people who are unavailable to us for one reason or another. But doesn't even that allow them a lot of latitude in terms of saying, I think we missed so many people of color, say people who are Hispanic or people are black, so we'll just adjust those numbers up. It seems to allow for a lot of latitude that could get into, just fake numbers.
Right, and that is why we are saying that the Census Bureau simply does not have the authority to do sampling surveys under the statutes because the Constitution only requires them to count the number of people in the country for apportionment purposes. And that is the census information that is required, but nothing beyond that.
Adi, is PLF taking legal action to try to shut this down?
Yes. So we last week we filed at Pacific Legal Foundation a class action up near Seattle to challenge this practice. And we are alleging in the lawsuit that the Census Bureau does not have the statutory authority and the constitutional authority to force individuals to answer the American Community Survey.
Adi, let me try a couple of other questions because I want to fill in the gaps on this. So somebody at the Census Bureau, these bureaucrats have decided the government would like to have this information. Is this the kind of information that they could only get from the census, or they could probably go out to the private sector companies who gather some or if not all of the information you mentioned? All these personal data pieces could be probably had from private companies who gather it for their own purposes, couldn't it?
That is right. I mean, the Census Bureau could gather information from local government officials. All of us pay property taxes and taxes to the state. So some of that tax information and demographic information is already in possession of government officials at the state and local levels. So that should be the first first place they should look for in collecting this information.
Well,
They could collect this information from other federal agencies, and if none of that satisfies the reason for collecting the information, they could potentially go to private companies. But the problem there is we have the Fourth Amendment that prevents them from collecting any information they wish without probable cause or without a warrant.
right. And I guess when I wanted the second question that goes with that one is, number one, couldn't they get this information elsewhere if they really need to know how many toilets the average person has in a house, or how far they drive to work, or their income, and that kind of information, if it wasn't available from government agencies? But the question that goes with that is, what does the government do with all this information? And is it something of value to the American people? Or are they gathering this data that's primarily then shared right back to the private sector, to companies that want it for marketing purposes or whatever? What do they do with the data?
So according to the Census Bureau, they are collecting this information so that local, state, and federal officials can better provide social services and social net programs to their constituents.
Does that make sense to you? No, but does that make sense to you, Adi?
That does not, because in our republic, it is the job of our elected representatives to be in touch with our people, with their constituents, to find out what their issues are, and then support or oppose measures in the respective state or federal legislatures based on the information that the representatives gather on their own. They can't, entrust the gathering of information to this agency, the Census Bureau, in violation of people's right to remain silent and in violation of people's privacy rights.
Because, as you pointed out, the government uses this arm that they have. A private company can't come to me and say, "Hey, Lars, tell me, how many times a week you eat tuna fish." But the government can come along with this community survey and say, if you don't answer it, we have ways to reach out and punish you for not doing that. Private companies can't do that.
That's exactly right. And private companies voluntarily collect information, and we voluntarily give some information to private companies. Now, it would be a different situation if the Census Bureau were to come to me and say, would you agree to give me this information? And then at that point, I can voluntarily choose to give them or not give them the information they're requesting. But the problem comes up when they're forcing people, they're compelling people to give this information. And if they refuse to do so, they're threatening them with fines.
And I'm glad to see that PLF is going to go after them. That's Adi Dinar, who is an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. Adi, thank you very much. I appreciate the time, and we'll check back in to see how that lawsuit is going. You want to check in with me? It's 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Right on the heels, or I guess just before, just after, the news that came that the Biden Ministry of Truth has now had a stake driven through its evil heart. We get the news that the Supreme Court has made a fairly significant First Amendment decision about free speech and about campaigns and about politics involving Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. Hans von Spakovsky joins me now, who's a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And he looked pretty darn good in that 2,000 Mules documentary, I have to say that. Hans, welcome back.
Lars, thanks for having me back.
And by the way, you did a great job on the documentary, and my only beef with it was I wish Dinesh had closed the loops a little bit more, finished the circle by going to, say, some local law enforcement, attorneys general, district attorneys, and saying, hey, doesn't this look like illegal activity you're seeing right there? And couldn't we bring charges against some of these people, or at least convene a grand jury and get some testimony? Before we get into Ted Cruz's case, do you think any of that is still possible? Because I know that at Heritage you keep track of all the criminal cases, and there are a lot of them involving election fraud in America. And I just wish Dinesh and the producers had gone to, say, the Georgia AG or the Pennsylvania AG or any of those other states' AGs and said, hey, is there a case here? And if not, tell us why.
Well, yeah, I mean, that would have been good. But look, there's absolutely nothing that prevents those law enforcement officials from going to him. And as far as I know, so far, they haven't done that, which unfortunately brings up how much law enforcement likes to ignore potential election fraud. There are numerous examples of that, and this is just another one.
Well, wouldn't it be great to put those people in front of a grand jury and say, by the way, we're giving you, they call it Queen for a day. It's immunizing you,
Right.
so you can't invoke your fifth, and say, okay, did you take money to deliver ballots in the dead of night wearing your hoodie? And who'd you get the money from? And boy, I think there's a trail there. John Durham's tied up with other things right now, but I think there's a hell of a trial there that you could pursue. And if you went out on all the threads, you'd find some good stuff. Tell my audience why this decision by the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of Senator Ted Cruz is so very important.
Well, what Ted Cruz sued over is this kind of bizarre rule for which there really was no justification in the campaign finance rules. In essence, look, a campaign for Congress can borrow money from a banker or a candidate can actually loan his own money to the campaign. The campaign is obviously supposed to pay that back, but there's this weird rule that says, and because of that, even after Election Day, candidates can continue to raise money to try to pay off that campaign debt, which is a good thing so that people actually get paid off. So they put in this bizarre rule that says, any contributions raised after Election Day to pay off a campaign debt to a candidate, you can't repay more than $250,000. So if a candidate loans more than that to his campaign, he's going to be out of that money. And Ted Cruz actually lent his campaign $260,000. He got repaid $250,000, but he was out $10,000, and he sued, saying, "Look, there's no justification for this." Supreme Court agreed. They said, "Look, when a campaign money is used for what? So a candidate can speak, tell people what his political views are, run for office. That's an expressive use of the First Amendment, and the government didn't have any good reason for putting this in. One of the only justifications that the Biden administration could come up with is, well, once somebody has won an election, why people are going to contribute to him money to him so that they can get favors from him. But the court said, well, if that's the case, why does this limit apply to losing candidates? Obviously, a losing candidate can't give any kind of official favors. And in any event, they can't contribute more than $2,900 for an election, whether they do it before the election or after. And that's the amount allowed because Congress has said, well, that amount, $2,900, doesn't raise any corruption implications. So they basically tossed it out. It was a 6-3 decision, the three liberals saying, oh, no, this is perfectly okay.
Well, and I guess what I'm wondering is when you said what was the motivation for the rule, I mean, most of the time I can look at federal laws or state laws and you can tell what they were trying to do. But like you said, what's the reason for limiting it to only $250,000 unless you're just saying we want to handicap anybody? Let's say a Bernie Sanders comes along. He raised, I think, some gigantic amount of money, 30 million donors and an average of $30 a piece. I think he raised about $90 million. But you say, having raised $90 million, you can't loan your campaign some money or get a loan for the money and then pay it back. None of this makes any sense. But is this a bigger victory for free speech in general? Because, Hans, I've always held, and you know that our home studios are in Oregon. Oregon's Supreme Court has actually held that money is free speech, and free speech is money. And so, therefore, in the state, there are no limits on how much. Now, there are limits on federal candidates, but on state candidates, you can have a guy like Phil Knight of Nike give $1 million to a candidate. There's no limit. And I've never had a problem with that idea, that money is free speech. Maybe in the days where you were running for town council in the 1800s and there was no media to speak of, and the most you were going to do is print a few handbills, not a problem. You could have free speech just about any other way. But these days, almost any modern campaign that uses social media, radio, television, newspapers, and everything else, it involves lots and lots of money. And if you say we're going to limit the money, then the only thing you are limiting is free speech.
Oh, no, but the U.S. Supreme Court agrees with that, and it's absolutely true. And by the way, look, most of the states, in fact, I think just about all the states, don't have any limit on a campaign being able to pay back a loan, including from the candidate. And the Supreme Court pointed out that the government couldn't produce a single case of corruption in any of those states just because the campaign repaid the candidate. And look, the reason this is really important is, and the court pointed this out, is the ability to repay a loan is especially important for new candidates and challengers.
Yep.
Because they don't have the kind of networks that incumbents have. And so when you're limiting loan repayments, you're actually hurting new candidates and challengers, because early spending is often critical to the newcomer's success.
Which means all this is a way of protecting incumbents.
That's exactly right, and the Supreme Court recognized that.
Well, I'm glad to see them do it. Do you think we're likely to get any kind of satisfaction on all the other election issues that were raised in the documentary you were in, 2,000 Mules?
Unfortunately not. Like I said, there's nothing to prevent law enforcement from investigating this. They ought to be investigating it. They ought to be contacting Dinesh D'Souza and saying, send us the information you have so we can identify and find those vote traffickers, those mules, so we can pull them in and investigate and ask them, where'd you get those ballots? Where'd you pick them up? Who paid you? So they can find out whether they were real ballots from real voters or whether they were fraudulent ballots and other illegalities occurred. But they're not doing that.
No, and what's funny, Hans, is having watched it, if anybody hasn't seen it, it's well worth seeing. I've got no other dog in the fight in that Dinesh is a friend. And I've said what I thought were the flaws in it, that it didn't close a lot of loops on the whole argument. But when they have all that raw data, people should understand you can't unmask that data and say, well, whose cell phone was that one that traveled to those places? But law enforcement can. They can go to the cell phone companies with a subpoena or a warrant and say, we want to know who that person was. Then you go talk to that person. You plop them down in front of a grand jury and say, look, you're going to need to tell us what's going on, or you're looking at charges. And when you say, well, this private nonprofit funded by Zuckerberg or Soros or whoever gave me the money, and then you're off to the races. Hans von Spakowski, thank you very much. Senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. We'll get to your phone calls and emails, too.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And as you know, on this program, naysayers go to the head of the line, although we haven't had any naysayers recently. Maybe they just lost their nerve or something. So many things are going south on them. I got up this morning early and got cleaned up, and then I put on one of my favorite Second Amendment shirts, not knowing that the U.S. Supreme Court was going to come down with a hugely consequential decision, although it seemed like kind of an obvious one to me. New York City had told its citizens for years, if you want to have your Second Amendment rights, you can have them in your house or in your apartment or your condo or your co-op, but you can't carry your gun outside. No, to get that, you need a big pile of money and or big political connections. Otherwise, you can't have a carry permit. That went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has said, hey, New York, that's unconstitutional. Knock it off. And, of course, the liberals are going absolutely crazy. So I thought I'd talk to Tom Jipping, who's Deputy Director of the Ed Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies and a Senior Legal Fellow at Heritage, about this. Tom, I hope you don't take this personally, that I would rather talk to somebody from Everytown or one of the rabidly anti-gun groups, but they won't talk to me, Tom. So I thought I'd talk to you and get you to give my audience an idea of where this takes us now.
Sure, and I would gladly step aside if that opportunity presented itself, but as with the upcoming decision regarding abortion, liberals, they say that they object to the decision, but they never point to where in the actual opinion explaining that decision there is a problem. Look, Justice Thomas in the decision today pointed out that both sides agree that the Second Amendment gives you the right to possess a firearm for self-defense, even outside the home. What makes this New York law unique, I think only 5 or 6 states try to do this, is that they make you not only meet certain objective criteria for a license, but they make you prove that you have a quote special need for a firearm for self-defense. Well, it's not a right if you have to convince some public official that you have a special need for it. Imagine if we did that for the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment, or imagine for the liberals, what if they did that with abortion? That you have to prove
imagine that.
Special need. I mean, liberals would go absolutely insane. So it was a very common sense, straightforward decision. A right is a right. Second Amendment gives law-abiding citizens the right to possess a handgun for self-defense, and you don't have to make some special showing to some bureaucrat to exercise that right.
I'm talking to Tom Jipping from the Heritage Foundation. So, Tom, it turns out that the very thing the libs thought was going to give them the greatest justification to argue for more gun laws actually worked against them, because didn't the court members in this big opinion, and they had concurring affirmations of I think I've used the wrong word, concurring majorities who wrote different opinions, but they said, look, Buffalo, New York just had a shooting, and clearly the restrictions on guns in New York did not constrain the killer in that case one little bit.
Well, that's a good example of where, in addition to is this a right or isn't it, you have the practical question of which is really more of a policy-oriented question, and that is, do any of these gun control ideas, and the same ones come up all the time, do any of them have any hope of improving the situation? And the New York State and Buffalo is the clearest example where they have those laws. There's not speculation about what if they did. They have those laws. And obviously they don't stop these kinds of shootings. Again, law-abiding citizens have a Second Amendment right to possess a firearm for self-defense. That's been true since before the Second Amendment was even part of the Constitution. I really want to emphasize what the court did, which is this right of self-defense predates the Constitution. It's even more important than rights that appeared for the first time in our Constitution. And this isn't the first time the Supreme Court has said so. This time they said, and we mean it.
And by the way, Tom, one of the things that's getting under my skin already, in the last couple of hours, I've seen headlines that say Supreme Court expands gun rights of Americans. Now, I think it's a know-nothing headline writer, but they didn't expand anything. All the court said was, you've always had that right, and New York unconstitutionally restricted it. Am I right?
That's right. Any court and the Supreme Court, I think Justice Thomas explained it in his opinion today, they do two things when they have a decision like this. They interpret and they apply, whether it's the Constitution or a statute. The interpretation of the Constitution is fixed. The application to different circumstances is what it can be more challenging. That's what the court did today. They didn't change the meaning of the Second Amendment. They didn't change the breadth of the right that you and I have to defend ourselves, but they applied it to the particular law in New York State that require that where the government really decides whether you have a need to exercise your Second Amendment right. That's what the media gets wrong, and that's why you see misleading headlines like that.
Tom, let me ask you a question. When they decided gay marriage, the so-called Obergefell decision, my recollection is within either hours or at most a day or two, there were gay marriages happening in all these states around America where it was illegal up until Obergefell was decided. It might have even been the same day. Now, in this case, when the court says to New York, you have unconstitutionally constrained the civil rights of your citizens, do we see the same kind of instantaneous reaction that citizens can now go to the state of New York today or tomorrow and say, hey, I want a permit, and I no longer have to show you a need?
Well, we'll see. I mean, remember in the civil rights movement, after Brown versus Board of Education, a lot of schools in the South and states in the South found ways of dragging their feet and still resisting, recognizing people's rights. You can bet that liberals, especially those in states like New York are going to do everything they can to prevent people from exercising the right that the Supreme Court today vindicated. And that's why, we have to be thankful to those organizations and plaintiffs who are willing to step up and go all the way to the Supreme Court, because they're defending the rights of all of us.
Well, I heard Eric Adams, this joker who's the mayor of New York, saying, well, we've got to prevent this from becoming the wild, wild west. I'll tell you what, Tim, I live out west, and while it's not the most conservative place in the world, we have fairly good laws on concealed carry, and not a week goes by when you don't hear about a homeowner killing somebody who came to the house to rob or hurt that person, and they're justifiable. So I'm kind of hoping, I hope that in New York City, honest, law-abiding citizens arm themselves up, and when somebody tries to mug them, you get the first half dozen or dozen dead bad guys on the ground, and that actually will have a positive effect for everybody else, whether you carry a gun or not, won't it?
Well, if what he means is, we're going to have people just shooting each other and, have all kinds of violence, sorry, we're already there in New York. And they've got a rogue prosecutor, district attorney in New York City, who's refusing to enforce all kinds of laws. People in New York ought to do what the people in San Francisco did with their rogue prosecutor and get rid of him. So
couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And by the way, I'd put that Manhattan DA on about the same par as George Gascon, who I think is going to be off with Chesa Boudin looking for a job here real soon. That's Thomas Jipping, the legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, deputy director of the Ed Meese Center. Back in a moment. I'll get to your calls. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. Anybody who drives a vehicle knows how much the cost of gas and diesel has gone up in the last year, but after blaming it on Russia and Vladimir Putin, after saying it was transitory and temporary, now Joe Biden claims it's America's incredible transition away from fossil fuels. Is he kidding? I'll tell you what, let's talk to Daniel Turner about it, the president of Power the Future. It sounds like maybe Joe has decided to tell the truth. Say, yeah, this is what we had in mind all along. It's going to get you transitioned over. Now, we don't have the electric cars for you to drive, and we don't have the electricity to charge them, but you'll definitely be off gas when it hits $10 a gallon. Is that the approach?
Yeah, it is. And sometimes, he says the quiet part out loud. He's not supposed to say this is the strategy. He's supposed to, show some sort of concern. What I thought was really telling about that same comment where he says that we're going through this incredible transition, and this is the result. He says, though, God willing, when this is over, it works. And by that, he is proving this is an act of faith, right? This is an act of faith in the climate religion. It has nothing to do with science or engineering or fact. It is a belief system. This is his religion, and he is going to force it upon you, no matter what any Supreme Court justice may say.
And that's what he's going to do. But are Americans ready to have this kind of thing happen? Because I reminded my audience, Daniel, that way back in 2008, you had Barack Obama saying, well, we kind of need $8 or $9 or $10 a gallon gasoline. It's just that he hoped that it would be a gradual transition, so we could be like the frog that gets boiled in the pot of water that started out cold and gradually got hotter to the point where the frog couldn't jump out anymore and ended up dying in the pot. He wants it to be that kind of gradual. This was rather direct and rather quick.
It really was. And one of the concerns I have about it is that we will accept it as the new normal if we're not careful. And you mentioned Obama, so let's stick with something else he meddled in, which was healthcare prices, right? And he said he was going to have an affordable plan, and it's been 12 years since then, and we have become accustomed to the fact that now most of us pay 3 and 4 times in premiums than what we were paying. That's just the new normal now. And not only that, but just a couple months ago, Obama was in the White House celebrating this great accomplishment. And no one ever looks and says, well, you just kind of mucked everything up, right? Everything's expensive now. That is my concern with energy prices, is that we will have a media brush over it. We'll talk about Putin. We'll talk about the great threat of climate change. We'll have all these people going to Davos like they are right now to talk about it. And little by little, the American people will just become like that frog and get accustomed to the fact that, it now costs $6 to fill up your tank, and that's just the way things are.
You know, Daniel, I make my home in Washington State. I'm waiting for them to demand a change of the name because, you know, it was named for a slaveholder and all that woke stuff. But in Washington State, the Daily Mail out of Great Britain pointed out that one of the major recognizable gas companies in America, Union 76, or now just the Big Orange 76, they've been reprogramming their gas pumps so they're capable of displaying a north of $10 a gallon price. And you say, well, it doesn't mean we'll get to it's just like the speedometer on my car, I think, goes to 150. I've never had it over 100, but it does go to 150. Except in this case, I wouldn't put it past them to push the prices that high. And that kind of thing is going to be absolutely destructive to almost everything in America. Especially, I agree with you that they try to norm us to abnormal ideas. They norm us to the idea that your kids will be taught about gender in kindergarten, and they norm us to, you know, taking a shot every 3 months and having to carry a vax card around, all kinds of sick, evil, twisted things that are being normed. But if they manage to norm it, I'm almost waiting, Daniel, for the day maybe this fall when the gas is peaked out at $8 or $9 a gallon, and then it drops by $1. And we all say, wow, look at that. Joe brought gas prices down from $9 a gallon to $8, and we're all celebrating because I got some kind of national version of Stockholm Syndrome.
Yeah, and I hope this is where the American people have a very good short-term memory, because it really was not that long ago that the average price of gas nationwide was under $2 a gallon. And many places in the country saw gas as low as $1.87 a gallon. And the only thing that's changed between now and then, besides administrations, is our energy policy. We don't have less oil in the ground, right? We don't have fewer men and women working in this industry, although maybe I'm sure some have through attrition because there's not as much work to be done right now. But all the materials are there. All we need is the political will and the permission, really, unfortunately, the cooperation of the government to do what we did back in 2018 and 2019. And I got to think there are enough. No one knows an economy better than a parent who's trying to pay for their kid's school and put food on the table and pay a mortgage. And they're the greatest economists we have. And I got to think there are enough of them who are looking at their monthly expenses and saying, this isn't sustainable. But not only that, it wasn't that long ago things were great. What the heck happened, and how do we go back to the good old days? Because we can. We really can.
See, I agree with you, Daniel, and double check me on these numbers because we could quickly get back to sufficiency and maybe even surplus. I mean, I know we are exporting some, but when Trump came in, if I remember right, 8 million barrels a day is what America was producing. And during less than 4 short years, it went from 8 million barrels a day. Those are 42-gallon, oil barrels. It went from 8 to 12. And you say, how in the world did you make that? Well, it wasn't that hard. Get the government out of the way and still do things sensibly and environmentally soundly, but get the government out of the way. So if we've now gone from a number that doesn't supply what we need, how do we get back to that other number? I would suggest that if Donald Trump could take it from 8 to 12, we could take it from 12 to 16 or whatever, and we'd be able to supply everything America needs and maybe even have some surplus to sell, and that's never a bad thing. That's Daniel Turner, the president of Power of the Future. Daniel, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. I want to tell you that Dr. Mike Fulgens is America's gold expert, and he was the 2021 Numismatic Dealer of the Year. That's coins. He predicts that silver prices are going to go up with inflation and industrial use. And his company, Universal Coin and Bullion, it's offering the new 2022 999 fine 1-ounce silver American Eagle coin at just $28 with free shipping. Buy American. These pure silver coins, backed up by the U.S. Mint, they hit the mark. Silver is up over 400% in the past 30 years. It's poised to go even higher. Silver and gold are hedges against inflation. They're life insurance for your investments. Everybody should own precious metals. I certainly do. Tina and I have for 20 years. Call Universal Coin and Bullion today at 1-800-UCB-GOLD and tell them Lars sent you. That's 1-800-UCB-GOLD for a tangible asset you can actually hold in your hand. Call Universal Coin and Bullion at 1-800-UCB-GOLD. Their experts will get you on the order list for that $28 American Silver Eagle coin today. 1-800-UCB-GOLD, and remember to tell them Lars sent you. Before deciding to invest, carefully review the important disclosures at universalcoin.com. and send your emails to talk@larslarson.com.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Your phone calls and your emails are welcome at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Emails go to talk@larslarson.com. I want to talk about Bill Gates a bit. I don't much like Bill Gates, and it's not just his software or his software company. I think the guy is a little bit on the strange side, and we've talked about this before. The fact that he remained an associate of the late Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted child molester, the man who should have gone to prison for a long, long time for obtaining sex from underage girls and providing underage girls to his friends for sexual favors. Okay, this is just, the guy's bad. I mean, Epstein was bad. And Gates stayed associated with him even after he knew about that. And in fact, I think you've probably heard Bill Gates and his wife Melinda have split. And one of the issues she brings up is not just Bill's weird relationship with his former girlfriend, who he insisted on spending a week with every year, even after he'd been married to his wife for decades. I can guarantee you that if I went to Tina Larson to say, hey, I've got this old girlfriend, and I'd like to fly to the other side of the country and spend a week with her, I promise nothing is going on. That's a non-starter all day long and twice on Sunday. So Gates is a weird character. But some of the things he gets the most accolades for are his involvement in, trying to get rid of malaria and going after AIDS and things like that are really difficult to criticize because they're worthy efforts if that's what they are. But an awful lot of people have watched Gates, especially during COVID, and have wondered about his involvement in decision-making about vaccines. And I want to play a couple of sound bites for you that we found just the other day. They had not been seen in public, I think, ever, but they were played. And I thought I'd share them with you. Play the first one about Bill Gates. He didn't know Donald Trump, even though they were both somewhat celebrities, before Trump became president. So play that one first.
I never met Donald Trump before he was elected. So I saw him at Trump Tower. I said, hey, science and innovation is a great thing. You should be a leader who drives innovation. And that conversation was about a broad set of things in energy, in health, in education. Pick things you want to do that are big. HIV vaccine, you could, accelerate that. Be associated with innovation.
Now, that's a worthy goal. Be associated with innovation. The weird thing is this. I want to play this next soundbite for you because Gates has been very, very involved with vaccines, and he's made a lot of people very suspicious of what his real agenda is. But then when he talked to Donald Trump as president, because he said he didn't even know him before Trump became president, Trump brought up the idea, because it is a concern in America, and we've actually talked about the subject for years on this program, years, way before the pandemic, about people who are suspicious of vaccines. And I think that some people have some legitimate criticisms of vaccines, and I think there are other things that are not as worthy. But Donald Trump brought up the idea to Bill Gates about having a special commission, since he was now president, to look into people's concerns about vaccine. Now, the thing is, anything I talk about on the air, I try to share with you, where did you get that information, Lars? How did you come to that conclusion? What data did you use? And if somebody said to me, Lars, I'm going to take one of your arguments for anything we talk about on this show, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to research it, and I'm going to look into it and see if I can find out anything that might be suspicious about the conclusions that you've reached. I say, go for it. And if you find out that I've misstated a fact, if you find out that something I've said does not square up with the current science or the current information out there, go ahead, because I'd rather hear about it and say, okay, I'll take a second look at that, and I'll look at the information you brought me. When Donald Trump brought up the idea to Bill Gates, again, a guy who's involved in technology and innovation, where If somebody comes to you and says, hey, I've got this great idea, a new kind of fuel, a new kind of electronic device, something new, you would think, well, I've never thought of it before. I've always dismissed the idea before, but I'll take a look at it. What was Bill Gates' reaction when he's talking to the president, the then president of the United States, and the president says, maybe we should have a commission look into some of the concerns that people have at vaccines? Because, well, I'll save my other comments for after. Listen to what Bill Gates tells him.
Then the second time I saw him was the March after that, so March 2017 in the White House. In both of those two meetings, he asked me if vaccines weren't a bad thing, because he was considering a commission to look into ill effects of vaccines. And somebody, his name is Robert Kennedy Jr., was advising him that vaccines were causing bad things. And I said, no, that's a dead end. That would be a bad thing. Don't do that.
Don't do that. Now, remember, science is about inquiry, all right? And there are plenty of scientists who've been told they were wrong. I mean, famously, there were some scientists that were forced to drink hemlock. There were people who were forced out of academics altogether because they came up with ideas, and the rest of the technology community at that time said that's a crazy idea. I think the Wright brothers were told they were crazy regularly. I think that the people who said we can fly to the moon and land on the moon, land a man on the moon, were told they were crazy regularly. And so you wonder, a guy who's involved in technology like Bill Gates is asked, should we have a commission to look into the concerns that people have about vaccines? Now, there are two possible outcomes if you actually did a legitimate investigation. One is you would find good, solid evidence that the concerns are not true, that they're not well-founded. And in that case, you could come back and say, listen, we've looked into all the concerns, whether it's autism, whether it's thimerosal, no matter what it is, you look into the concerns, you investigate, and you find out that the concerns were not true, were not well-founded. Or you could say, we're going to look into those things, and you find out that the concerns were very well placed. Now, I don't know which one it would have ended up being, but for somebody like Gates, who, again, he founded a company that created this software that has made him the richest man on the planet. And he did that not by saying, let's not look into that, but by going out and looking into places where other people did not look. And doesn't it seem odd that a guy in his position would say, there are people in America with great concerns about vaccines, and of course, they've been highlighted a lot in the last 2 years, and that a guy like Bill Gates would say, no, don't even look there. Don't investigate, don't inquire. It's a dead end. Stay away from it. Very, very strange. You got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'll be glad to get back to your phone calls and emails shortly at 866-HEY-LARS. If you're a naysayer, we put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find that at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and at LarsLarson.com on the web. It's a real pleasure to welcome from the Heritage Foundation our friend Cully Stimson. Ms. Stimson, thanks a lot for taking the time today.
Lars, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
I want to talk about your book in a bit, Rogue Prosecutors, of which you are the co-author along with Zach Smith, how radical Soros lawyers are destroying America's communities. But I wanted to start, if you don't mind, because within the last few hours, we've heard that Hunter Biden, the president's son, who will plead guilty to breaking federal laws, both tax laws and gun laws, is going to get off essentially with almost no punishment whatsoever. And I want to get your take on that.
Well, I'm not surprised that there was a wraparound deal at the front end, which means, as a former federal prosecutor, what you do is you get with the defense attorney and you see whether they're going to ward off an indictment. And so here, from what I'm reading, there's a complaint. He's agreed to plead to 2 misdemeanors of tax evasion and then the misdemeanor of failing to be honest on a firearms form, ATF form, because when he was asked whether he has a drug or alcohol problem, he said no, and of course the videos prove otherwise. Now, the judge has to accept the deal, Lars, but I suspect that's been greased with the judge already. So we'll see how this plays out.
I want to ask you about that, though, because, Cully, I'll tell you, I drink an adult beverage now and then. I don't take illegal drugs. He's going to be allowed to plead guilty to misdemeanors, even though he could have been brought up on the tax law. I think it's still a misdemeanor, but on the gun law. I own guns. Every time I fill out a Form 4473, it asks me a bunch of questions. Hunter Biden answered those questions and lied. And right at the bottom of the form, it warns everybody who signs it, including people like me, if you've lied on part of this form and you sign it, you're committing the written version of perjury, which I think they call false swearing, and it's punishable by 5 years in federal prison, and it is a felony. Why, in a case like that, would Hunter Biden be allowed to be able to do that when other people actually have gone to prison for not paying their taxes, have gone to prison for lying on that form, and yet we're going to cut the president's ne'er-do-well son a break?
Well, Lars, the problem with you and me is that our last name isn't Biden.
Yeah.
Because I've signed the same form in purchasing my weapons. And I suspect what's happening, and all kidding aside, is that his defense attorney has done a very good job playing up on the name of his client, Biden, with this Justice Department, and setting the last name aside. He said, look, it's obvious this guy has been in and out of drug treatment programs. It's obvious that he didn't want to be honest on the form. This isn't the crime of the century. He wasn't doing it to evade detection. He was just doing it because he was embarrassed. And that's probably the argument he's put forth. And the Biden Justice Department and this U.S. Attorney for the District of Delaware has bought off on it. Now, there's political accountability here, but not much because there's separation of powers issues. And so I suspect this plea deal is going to go through, and that's going to be the end of it.
See, I understand that somebody might make the argument about embarrassment, but the fact is, if you answer yes, I do use illegal drugs, and there are people in America right now, I don't happen to be one of them, who want to use legal marijuana. It's legal in their states. It's not legal at the federal level. And they've asked the ATF recently, and the ATF has said, if you use pot, legal in your state though it may be, it is still illegal federally, and we're not going to sell you the gun. So it wasn't really about embarrassment. It was, if I answer yes on that question, you won't be embarrassed in front of anybody but the gun seller and maybe some faceless bureaucrat of the ATF, but they're not going to sell you the gun if you're honest. And if his dad's point has been, we've got to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, his son is one of those criminals. And the issue isn't embarrassment. The issue is they wouldn't have sold you the gun if you were honest on the form. And I like John Adams, never knew the guy because he was before my time, but he believed we should be a nation of laws where everybody gets equal treatment under the law. This seems like hugely unequal treatment.
It is, and obviously it is. And I'm sure that in the days and weeks to come after the plea deal is accepted and sentences imposed, people will point out numerous cases where people similarly situated were jacked up by the federal government, prosecuted, and got time in prison. But the problem for them is that their last name is not Biden. And this further erodes erodes people's trust in the justice system and contributes to this narrative, which has some teeth, that there's a two-tier system of justice. I mean, you look at the Durham report, right?
Yep.
The Durham report lays bare the rot at the top of the Justice Department and the so-called Russian hoax that was entirely manufactured by the Clinton campaign and Hillary herself. And yet, who paid the price for that? Nobody except Mr. Klein-Smith, who got a slap on the wrist because he filed a false affidavit before the FISA court. But Strzok, Page, and the rest of them are getting paid, I'm sure, a healthy sum to be on other networks to say, nothing to see here, move along. And so this is not going to help the situation. This is going to make things worse. But, of course, it's great for Hunter Biden.
You know, I wish it had gone to trial because the other details, Mr. Stimson, and tell me if you've heard them differently, is that Hunter Biden illegally bought a gun, illegally carried a gun. He wasn't under Secret Service protection because I think he'd voluntarily waived it off because he decided bringing the Secret Service along for his coke binges and his prostitution encounters probably wasn't the best idea. his I guess now ex-wife Hallie Biden took his gun and threw it in a trash can across from a Delaware high school, where it was retrieved by a guy looking for recyclables. And then the Secret Service, at least according to the gun shop owner, came in and tried to seize the paperwork from the purchase, even though Biden wasn't under Secret Service protection. Hunter Biden was not at the time. So you've got federal agencies, law enforcement agencies that want the rest of us to trust them, who are providing political protection for years under this situation. And it really makes me angry.
Well, it should. It stinks to high heaven. And what I'm going to be watching as a former criminal defense attorney and prosecutor is the following. How much time does the judge hang over this guy's head, if any, and how long is the probation period? Because I think a person like Hunter, who's had a lot of brushes with the law and clearly has substance abuse and other problems, probably will violate his parole or probation. And then what happens? Because if nothing happens then, and they don't revoke him and bring him back and sentence him to the full course that he could be sentenced to, then it's even more rotten than you can imagine.
Because the system, both at the local level and the federal level, PVs are about as common. Parole violations are very common. People get, as they call it, violated, meaning not that they were violated, but that their parole was revoked because of that. They go back to jail and they go back to prison. And you're suggesting Hunter Biden is almost certain to violate this and almost certain not to get any kind of punishment for it, showing that we've got this, I guess, royal family of the Bidens who get protection in office and out of office.
Yeah, and add the Clintons to that, because, of course, parole or probation is a privilege, not a right. In fact, it's a privilege in lieu of prison or jail. But a lot of people violate the privilege of being out on the streets, and yet very few people, especially in these rogue prosecutor cities, are going to revoke people's probation or parole and sentence them to jail or ask the judge to impose the full sentence. And I suspect Hunter's got a very good assurance by the Justice Department that they're going to not ask for any time whatsoever. And of course, they can't make it a promise about what they would do if they violate his parole, because they won't do that.
Unfortunately. The book that he's written along with Zach Smith is Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. It's out in paperback, or will be out in paperback, and I'm anxious to read it myself because I have a lot of concerns about those rogue prosecutors that George Soros, the billionaire, has managed to install in office in so many places around America. We'll get to more about that coming up in the next segment. Glad to get your phone calls and emails later at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's my pleasure to have Cully Stimson with me right now, the author, along with Zach Smith, of Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. Ms. Stimson, I've been involved myself, at least on the radio, because prosecutors that I know who I trust have reached out to me saying the Soros types and other people who are politically aligned, not always Soros, but other people who spend their money the same way, have sought to put very radical prosecutors in place around America. Would you mind explaining to my audience what you tell in this story of rogue prosecutors and about what the real hazard is to American communities of having those people in office?
Sure, Lars. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for featuring our book. And it's not a think tanky, boring white paper with a million footnotes. This is a real crime novel focusing on 8 cities with Soros bought and paid for rogue prosecutors, with stories oftentimes never told before because of all the people we've interviewed and who came forward to us. And the problem with this failed social experiment is that it's incredibly well funded. It started in 2016. And the Soros bought and paid for rogue prosecutor system and ecosystem believes that, one, the entire criminal justice system is racist. Of course, it's not. And that the only way to change that is to fundamentally reverse engineer and dismantle, those are their words, not mine, the system as we know. And we have an adversarial system. We have 2,300 elected DAs around the country. These are low visibility, low dollar affairs. And so they started pumping money into primaries, first started in Chicago with Kim Foxx, to unseat law and order DAs, oftentimes Democrats, and replace them with pro-criminal, anti-victim zealots. And the movement started in 2016. It's gotten worse and worse. And now about 60% of the country is covered by rogue prosecutors. It's about 70 of them out of the 2,300. It's bad news.
Well, let's talk about the system at first, the indictment that they've made, and then we'll get into what this is actually doing. Because I want to ask you, the system is built with a bunch of checks and balances in it. If you have a crazy prosecutor somewhere who just says, I'm going to start charging people right and left because they're people of color, because they're from a minority community of one kind or another, racial, sexual, religious, or otherwise, there's a check against that because we also have in most places elected judges who can look at the charge and say, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to reject this case because you've stepped over the line. And you also have state legislatures that can act and say, we've got an out-of-control prosecutor. He's using the system in a way that it was never intended to, and the people's representatives can shut that down. Those protections are already there. The Soros people, or Soros himself and the people around him, want to circumvent the whole system and say, we'll install somebody who will take laws written by the people's representatives, enforced by prosecutors, and then judges and juries who make the ultimate decision if somebody is guilty. And we want to just circumvent the system and replace our idea, or the people's laws, with our idea of justice. Is that simplifying it too much?
No, and in fact, the first type of prosecutor you talked about, the sort of selective prosecution based on a constitutionally protected class, that's a problem. As you said, the judges and legislatures will correct those problems through appropriate rulings from the bench or appellate courts or through legislative oversight. But this issue, I mean, you got to hand it to Soros and Dustin Moskovitz and Kerry Toon and these other tech billionaires who funded this radical movement. They realized early on that the prosecutor, the 2,300 elected DAs, they are the gatekeeper to the criminal justice system. It's not the cops, it's not the sheriffs, it's not the mayor, it's not the governor, it's the DA. She and she alone makes the decision of whether to prosecute or not. So instead of having a selective prosecution problem, which can be stopped, they engage in prosecutorial nullification. They decide to wave their regal wand and not prosecute all misdemeanors, or most of them. Water down most felonies to misdemeanors. Never seek the death penalty, never seek life without parole, never send a juvenile violent criminal to adult court, never ask for long sentences. In fact, order their prosecutors not to. George Gascon in L.A. has ordered his 1,000 DAs to join in a motion with the public defender's office to release people who've been sentenced to life without parole or long sentences after they've served 15 years and let them out. And the list goes on and on and on. And so it's ingenious. It doesn't take a lot of money to elect a DA. Most DA offices, elections are, 100,000, 50,000. The big cities are, even $1 million goes a long way. That's the whole election. And so they've been very successful. They've suffered some noteworthy defeats, like Chesa Boudin in San Francisco and Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore, Kim Gardner in St. Louis, and Rachel Rollins in Boston, each of which has a chapter in our book. But they're well-funded, $40 million in direct spending from Soros and almost $1 billion in indirect spending to elect these 70-plus prosecutors across the country. So it's dangerous.
I'm talking to Cully Stimson, along with Zach Smith, wrote Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. So in a lot of ways, this is a very anti-American movement by Soros and company. And let me describe it, and feel free to push back and tell me I'm wrong. We have a system where the people get a chance to influence the system. We have a representative form of government, a constitutional republic, in which the people tell their representatives, we'd like a law against this, we'd like to get rid of these other laws, and then those laws are written and enforced. And we have, in many cases, most cases, elected district attorneys or prosecutors. So this cuts around all of that, and it's an anti-American activity, saying the elites know better about what real punishment is, and the people's representatives have nothing to say about it effectively.
I give you an A- as a law student on that, Lars, because you're right. The legislative branch passes the laws, and the executive branch, here represented by the local DA, is supposed to faithfully execute and carry out those laws. They do not have the legal authority, nor is it built into the system for them to decide which crimes not to prosecute. Now, yes, they do use prosecutorial discretion each and every day in those 2,300 DA offices and in those 94 U.S. attorneys' offices. But prosecutorial discretion is much different than what they're doing, and they're doing is prosecutorial nullification. And so this system that we have is not perfect. We have 18,000 police departments, 2,300 DA offices, 3,143 counties, but it relies on an adversarial criminal justice system, a hard-charging, ethical, fair prosecutor against a hard-charging, ethical, fair criminal defense attorney, and a neutral, detached judge, and a jury of your peers. But when you swap or replace the prosecutor with a pro-criminal, anti-victim zealot who's carrying out social justice and won't prosecute people who actually commit crimes, what's happened in those cities, Lars, and this is the sad irony of this movement, is black and brown minorities have suffered terribly in these cities.
Yep.
Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Baltimore, L.A., black and brown minorities, mainly black men, suffer. And you saw in my book, in the first chapter, in the introduction, the number of extra murders that took place, the number of extra rapes, the number of extra aggravated assaults compared to the 5-year running average before they were elected. And this has nothing to do with COVID. All of these folks were elected prior to COVID. So COVID had nothing to do with this. This is their policies. And of course, in the cities with real prosecutors, law and order, normal people who do their job, crime has not gone up. And so it's not a problem that the crime is going up all around the country. It's just in the cities with the rogue prosecutors.
I'm talking to Cully Stimson, who, along with Zach Smith, have authored Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying American Communities. We'll continue in just a moment, and then I'll be glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll @Lars Larson Show. And you're listening to The Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to take your calls, but we'll do that a bit later. Cully Stimson is my guest. He, along with Zach Smith, authored Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying American Communities. What does this have to do with their beliefs, and how is it that people like George Soros, an American citizen, I don't necessarily like that, have said we're going to fund an effort to replace prosecutors with prosecutors who will refuse to enforce the laws? What do you read in this belief structure? What do they believe should be the way that the system operates?
Yeah, so in the previous segment, I mentioned that that they believe that the entire criminal justice system is racist, and the only way to change it is to replace law and order prosecutors with pro-criminal zealots. But honestly, when we were writing this book, Lars, we learned a lot because we read Angela Davis and we read a lot of other radicals in the past, and this movement, believe it or not, grew out of the prison abolitionist movement, which exists. I didn't even know it exists until I started writing about this about 3 years ago. Angela Davis wrote a book, Are Prisons Obsolete? She says yes. Normal people say no. I say hell no. And this Marxist-inspired, anti-capitalist, anti-prison abolitionist movement is the animating force behind this movement. And we spent our first chapter on the origins, playbook, and beliefs, tracing their words and their scholarship and connecting it directly to the rogue prosecutor movement, which they're very proud of. They write about it. There's law review articles or so-called law review articles and papers out there about it. But we stitch it all together, and we bring all the pieces of the mosaic into one picture so people can see the big moving parts. But that's what it comes from. And so they believe anytime you send somebody, any criminal, to prison, you're putting them back on the plantation. That's their words. They believe that the modern prison is the modern equivalent of the slave plantation. And so they're not going to be sending anybody to the plantation. It's wacky.
But it is wacky because let me ask you this. Even though there may be, compared to their percentages in the general population, a greater proportion, the imprisonment of black and brown criminals is disproportionate to their presence in the population, still the prison system holds a majority of people who are white, many of them, well, most of them, white men. So how do they square that up, saying if this is putting people on the plantation, the majority of people on that plantation are white males, the so-called privileged group within America, if you take their point of view?
They don't, and they don't even try to. And in fact, they ignore these inconvenient facts. They ignore, for example, the fact that more white men have been executed since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976 than black men. They simply say that as a proportion of the society, more black men have been executed, or as a proportion of society, more black men have been sent to prison. Well, that's because, sadly, black men perpetrate more violent crimes than white as a proportion of their color in society. But that's just a reality. But they don't want to acknowledge that. And so they simply stir the racial pot and try to get people to believe that you have to, quote, reimagine prosecution and decarcerate, all these fluff terms that they've made up and had people buy into. So, for example, I'm sure you know, because you follow this, that crime, especially violent crime, has been decreasing dramatically since the last peak in 1992. And you know, because you're a smart guy and you follow this, that incarceration rates have been declining dramatically since its peak in 2008. And you also know that almost 70% of people in state prison are there because they were convicted of violent crime. They weren't there for simple possession of drugs. And so the crime spike only started again in 2016 when these radical Soros people came into office. But in other cities with real prosecutors, crime has remained the same. So they can't defend this on the merits because this has nothing to do with the merits.
I'm talking to Cully Stimson, who's written Rogue Prosecutors, along with Zach Smith. But let me ask you this. If we take their notion that we should decarcerate, we should stop locking people up, especially this huge percentage, and you're right, the prisons are full of the worst of the worst of the worst. I happen to live in a state in which 75% of felons see not one single day in prison, black or white, not one day for the worst kind of crimes. That means the other 25% they do lock up are not just felons, but the worst of the felons, usually the violent ones. What kind of society do they imagine where even when you commit the worst crimes, you won't be locked up? What do they imagine will replace that? And what do they imagine will happen when you start communicating to the criminal community, if you can describe it that way? You can do really bad things and nothing much is going to happen to you and we won't lock you up. What do they imagine is going to be that kind of society?
So their, quote, solution, unquote, of course, is the same old tired leftist solution, which is reinvesting more money in education and housing and drug treatment. And, you know, we quote, and again, this is not a think tanky, boring white paper on steroids. This is a true crime novel with some real facts and figures and internal memos and stuff from DA offices. We quote Rafael Manguel. We quote Barry Latzer and other top criminologists that show in places where those investments, as they call them, have been made at a substantial level, crime hasn't gone down at all. And so they don't really offer real solutions, Lars. They just know that their preferred policy outcome is not to send people back to the plantation. And, of course, who does that harm the most? Victims, and victims in neighborhoods that are vulnerable. And so when you go to really vulnerable neighborhoods, like I did when I was a homicide prosecutor here in D.C., the folks there, they don't ask for fewer police. They ask for more police who look like them, police who they can trust.
Yep.
You know, they don't want to have to testify against the bad guy down the street because everyone knows who he is. Everybody knows who the bad guys are. So when you don't ask for bail, which is one of the playbooks of these rogue prosecutors, where do the criminals go? They go right back to the neighborhood, and everyone's scared to death that these guys are going to take out revenge on them. And so this movement's playbook is criminals are the victims, cops are the bad guys, and real victims are to be ignored. And so that's why some of these places, these victims groups have been suing these DAs because they're violating their state victims' rights statutes.
It is such a pleasure to have you on. Cully Stimson with the Heritage Foundation, along with Zach Smith, has written Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. Are you a small business owner who could use a few $100,000 and who couldn't? Employee retention tax credits are an incredible opportunity. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic. They've already helped out 1,500 small business owners, and they got $300 million in funding. And believe me, Get My Funds knows what they're doing. They have a team of CPAs who specialize in filing for these tax credits. They're with you every step of the way, even if there's an audit. If you retain 5 or more W-2 employees during COVID, even if you already got the PPP money, you need to call Get My Funds now. 800-535-2950. It's not a grant. It's not a loan. It's a tax refund. And there are no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with the team you can trust at getmyfunds.com. 800-535-2950 or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. Back in just a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. Would you believe this, that an awful lot of social media that constantly uses the excuse that what they're doing is trying to control things like child sex trafficking, and especially child pornography, all of which they should be doing. They use that as an excuse for all the censorship they've been imposing elsewhere. And yet, it turns out that some of what Meta platforms, which we used to know as Facebook, have algorithms built into their networks that actually enable the child sex traffickers, enable the underage sex content. I'll cite the Wall Street Journal. Instagram, the popular social media site owned by Meta Platforms, helps connect and promote a vast network of accounts openly devoted to the commission and purchase of underage sex content, according to investigations by the Wall Street Journal and researchers at Stanford University and the University of Massachusetts. Pedophiles have long used the internet, but unlike the forums and the file transfer services that cater to people who have interest in illicit content, Instagram doesn't just host these activities, it's algorithms. Those are mathematical formula and other web coding is used to promote that kind of activity. Instagram connects pedophiles and guides them to content sellers via recommendation systems that excel at linking those who share those kinds of interests. The researchers found that Instagram enabled people to search explicit hashtags like pedo whore, PEDOWHORE, and preteen sex, and then connects them to accounts that use those terms to advertise child sex material for sale. Such accounts often claim to be run by the children themselves, and they use overtly sexual handles incorporating words like, and I don't even want to say that one on the air, but what they've found, this is what the researchers found at Stanford, Instagram accounts offering to sell illicit sexual material generally don't publish it openly, instead posting menus of content. Certain accounts invite buyers to commission specific acts, some menus including prices for videos of children harming themselves and imagery of minors performing sexual acts with animals. Now, you would think that if Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and the rest, if they could do as much political content monitoring as they've done over the last couple of election cycles, the very least they could do is go after this child sex garbage and shut it down. They say they're capable of doing it. They should do it. They claim they're doing it. They're not doing it, is what it sounds like. Let's go to Jason. Hey, Jason, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind today?
Oh, yeah, take my call after all that. Gee, thanks a lot, Lars.
Well, it does kind of relate, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess it does. It lumps in there. I've got a conspiracy theory.
Okay.
I can drive a wedge into this somehow. About these perverted teachers, we've got to do something. This is really getting out of hand. I mean, even though circumcision is in the Bible, it's been going on for thousands of years.
Yep.
You know, there's millions of girls out there in the world right now that have had gender mutilation. I'm not too sure what's going on with all that. You might get a woman's opinion.
We've had women on to talk about that, including a young lady that I happened to meet when we were at Stanford at the Hoover Institution. We go down there about once a year, and she told me that is one of her special issues that she tracks. And I said, what brought you to that? And she said, it was done to me. This is an adult woman who's well-educated. She's an activist on this subject because it was done to her. And you understand there's a world of difference between circumcision done to males and the kind of mutilation they do to little girls, which is specific, and it's culturally based, somewhat religiously based, by various cultures that say we want to make sure women get no pleasure out of sex and that, in fact, sex can be painful for them. And that's not the case for males who are circumcised. So I'm with you all the way. But you know what is tough to do, Jason? We call medical professionals who work in that field, and they say, we don't want to come on the air and talk about it. And I say, why not? And they said, because we draw too much negative attention. And in fact, there was a federal act that made it illegal for doctors to do this to girls in the United States because they're aware that there were people coming in from other parts of the world as immigrants who would bring this horror show with them and then ask doctors to do it here, sometimes foreign-born doctors who come here and they want to continue doing here what they did there, and they have to be told, no, you can't do it. And most states right now do not have a law that makes it illegal for a doctor to mutilate a little girl like that. And I find that shocking. I would think it'd be the easiest law in the world that you could show up at the state legislature and say, hey, anybody in favor of mutilating little girls done by OBGYNs? You'd get, every hand in the room would say, no, we're not. And then you'd pass a law and it'd be done. But strangely enough, they shot down the federal law in the courts. They said you can't do this from the federal level, but the states can do it. I would think that every one of the 50 states would have it. Last time I checked, most of the states do not have a law that forbids doctors from doing this to little girls, which is kind of a stunner, but hey, it's a strange world these days.
Yeah, it's really sad. We need to get to the root of the problem. The American people need to fight back, and like they were taking over that protest the other night where fists started flying. We need to see more of that.
In Glendale, California. Well,
yeah,
I'm not in favor of changing public policy by brawls outside of a school board meeting, but I'm with you in terms of shutting down these other practices. Mutilation of little girls ought to be illegal, and the person who does it, doctor or not, should go to prison for a long time. Let's go to Scott. Hey, Scott, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Lars. First-time caller, long-time listener.
Thank you.
I'd like to my conspiracy theory sort of ties in with the last caller as to why the left is pushing this transgender ideology on not only the kids but on everyone else in society. And I believe that in 2024, the next Democrat nominee they're going to have is Michelle Obama.
I don't think so.
When
okay,
the proverbial stuff is a fan in that particular subject, in my opinion, because I don't know if you're aware, but on Twitter there's been many discussions of the fact that Michelle Obama could possibly be a transgender man.
I've heard the theories. I don't have any evidence to say so one way or the other, but I've certainly heard it. So that's your conspiracy theory for today? Can I tell you, it sounds like your phone is breaking up, but Scott, I don't think she has any interest in the job. I think she likes just being rich. Let's go to Pinball. Hey, Pinball, we got about a minute. What's on your mind?
Let me take you off speaker. Yes, Lars, this camping ban that got passed yesterday, the one city council member who voted against it, Carmen Rubio, I wonder if she would like to take these homeless campers on her property and let them camp there.
I think that'd be great. It'd give her a real up-close and personal look at the kind of problem it presents, wouldn't it?
And not only that, but it doesn't take effect till July 1st. And according to our mayor, for the first 2 months, 6 weeks, we're going to educate them. Then you get 2 warnings. Then you get criminally charged. Well, guess what? You get a D- for effort.
Thanks for the call, Pinball. I appreciate it. It's a Conspiracy Theory Thursday, and you're listening to the Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Pleasure to be with you. And if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's easy. 866-HEY-LARS. And naysayers go to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You can vote in our Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show. I think that all of us have experienced the absolutely devastating kind of inflation that we have seen in America right now. We know what's causing it: massive spending by the United States government. Well, it seems to be easing just a bit after it hit some of the highest rates last year. But saying that we're better than last year at 4% seems like kind of weak tea compared to getting back to the 2% that America enjoyed for so very long. So I thought we'd get Gerard Simica on, who's chair of the free market group called Consumer Action for a Strong Economy. Mr. Simica, welcome to the program.
Hey, good afternoon, Lars. Great to be with you.
I want to ask you about something, about a federal steel can tax. What the heck is that?
Well, it's an issue that is really flying under the radar right now. Nobody's really talking about it, and that's something that we hope to change. But as you mentioned, we're now starting to feel a little bit of the loosening of inflation's iron grip. There is a company, a $10 billion steel giant out in Cleveland called Cleveland-Cliffs, who is petitioning the U.S. government, the Biden administration, and the Commerce Department for an increase of up to 300% tariffs of imported tin plate steel, which is what we use for hundreds of everyday items that people buy, but especially things like food, pet food, aerosols, oil cans. So this is something that would be really devastating to Americans who are, trying to put food on the table and just trying to pay their bills right now.
Yeah, because when I first saw that we're going to talk to you, I thought, is tin plate the stuff they make washers and dryers and dishwashers and things or like that out? No, this is the stuff, so in effect, almost everything that comes in a metal can from the store is made out of tin plate. Is it fair to say that?
A large segment of and there's different kinds of tin plates, so it can vary. But this tin plate that we're talking about we use tons of it every month, and American domestic steel makers don't even make enough to meet demand. A lot of the steel volume that our steel industry who have invested in upgrading their equipment and new technologies, they're supplying other kinds of steel, like for the auto industry or for the energy industry or for, fine-tune electronics and satellites and things like that. This is a small portion of the overall steel industry, but from the consumer standpoint, it is exactly what puts, food on the table. It puts corn in the can, and whether it's, again, hundreds of items people buy every day, if these tariffs were to go through, you'd see prices increase on each item of can anywhere from 20 to 56 cents. And it's something people are going to notice when they're at the store.
Yeah, I take it this is being done as a protectionist move, saying if you don't give us a 300% tariff on imported tin plate, then the domestic manufacturers are going to have a hard time existing, and it'll all end up being imported. Is that the general logic behind those who want the tariff?
Well, it is one company. There's two main companies that actually manufacture tin plate steel. One is U.S. Steel, and they are not part of this petition. Cleveland-Cliffs and they and their union are the sole movers of this effort. And it would raise their profits handsomely because it would price out steel from many of our competitors. It would also cause supply chain shortages because the people who use can manufacturers and others who manufacture goods from tin plate are going to be scrambling to find supply. America can only make about 50% of the tin plate that we actually need for our economy. So where are we going to get the other 50%? Either we're going to go without or we're going to be paying a lot more for it. And that's where the other countries that are importing aren't going to pay for it. It's going to be the consumers who ultimately will pay for the price hike. But as you mentioned, go ahead.
I guess here's what I'm wondering about, because I'm not an economist, but I understand what protectionist measures are. I don't like them. I also don't like America not making the majority of the goods it needs to make. I'd like to see more of it made here. Is there any reason why there aren't manufacturers in America who could make up the other 50%? And if so, why are they not doing it right now?
I think it's a matter of profitability and what the steel industry made a conscious decision that certain other areas of steel are growing and more profitable. For a long time, tin plate steel was gradually decreasing as an important element in the economy. You see a lot of innovation and things, packaging. We've gone from juice boxes to pouches to all kinds of new products. So,
right.
So tin has kind of, it's not quite the horse and buggy, but there are a lot of other uses for steel that have advanced. American steel has shoved their chips onto the table, as I mentioned before, in these other areas, like automobile manufacturing and heavy equipment. In 2018, President Trump instituted a very broad range of steel tariffs across many nations, very, very stiff penalties. was very protectionist in some people's eyes. Whether you agree or disagree, the bottom line is it created an umbrella for companies like Cleveland-Cliffs and others to increase their investment in production of tin plate steel. But they didn't. They, again, invested in other types of steel and are shifting their volume towards more lucrative and profitable types of steel production.
I'm talking to Gerard Simica, who's chair of the free market group called Consumer Action for a Strong Economy. You know what this almost reminds me of, Ms. Simica, is I think it was Bush who put tariffs, it might have been Obama, put tariffs on like the low-cost automobile tires. And a lot of the American companies said, we don't make that stuff. That stuff's made in Asia. We make the expensive tires, but the regular little, tires you put on a Toyota Corolla that's 20 years old, that's made overseas. So the sanctions against, that protected American industry to make it, American industry wasn't interested in making it. It sounds like this is the same kind of thing. Am I right?
You are exactly 100% right. This is in order for tariffs can be effective if you find that countries are rigging the rules and playing unfairly. And the Section 232 petition that they're filing is normally what a president or a company might file in order to say this is a national security issue. It's very targeted towards one nation and usually towards a particular type of product. But they're doing a shotgun approach. They are filing this petition against 8 countries, some of our best trading partners like the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, South Korea, and hoping it sticks. And what's going to happen, of course, if it were to go through, these countries would retaliate against U.S. Exporters. Right. And so our businesses here would find it harder to get their products in. So it's all of us really versus Cleveland-Cliffs. This will benefit them. This will help line their pockets. It will increase their margins and increase their prices. But all of that is going to come right out of the pockets of U.S. consumers.
Absolutely. That's Gerard Simica from Consumer Action for a Strong Economy. Sir, thank you very much. What if you could help turn back the clock and help your dog play like a puppy again, no matter their age? It's Lars, and it sure works for Sir Winston Churchill, my Bernese Mountain Dog. That's why Dr. Marty developed Nature's Blend, because your dog needs a diet full of real cuts of meat, similar to what they'd eat in the wild. Dogs go bonkers for Nature's Blend. When given the choice between Nature's Blend and the giant online retailer's #1 bestseller in dry dog food, a study shows 29 out of 30 dogs choose Nature's Blend first. Tori from Tulsa says, my fur baby is so eager to eat it. Other dog foods I've tried gave my sweet boy issues with allergies. They all went away with Dr. Marty's and Nature's Blend. Give your dog a food they'll love and help support their youthful energy, healthy skin, easy digestion, and a happy full life. For a limited time, claim 54% off Nature's Blend and get a free pack of premium dog treats from Dr. Marty Pets. Go to drmartypets.com/pets or text PETS to 511-511. That's text PETS to 511-511. Study available on request, message, and data rates apply. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. If I were honest with you, and I try to be honest with you every single day, I don't think unions have any business representing any government workers, and especially when it comes to schools. And the reason is it is an incestuous relationship where the labor union represents hundreds of thousands, in some cases tens of thousands, but large numbers of public employees. And then they gather up gigantic amounts of money. Just do the math. Say 500,000 public workers times $1,000 a year is $500 million. And it takes very little of that, a smaller proportion of it, to run the union. And the rest of it they spend on politics. And as I know, the number's about 99% on Democrats, who then vote for more money for the union. It is insider trading at its worst. But then you've got Randy Weingarten, who is the head of the AFT, American Federation of Teachers, the largest teachers union in America, I believe, although Max will correct me if I'm wrong. Max Nelson is director of labor policy at the Freedom Foundation. Hey, Max, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Lars. Pleasure to be back.
So you've got Randy Weingarten heading up the AFT to represent all the teachers in America. Was she really a teacher?
So Randy Weingarten has extremely limited teaching experience. And just for a minor correction here at the outset.
Oh, I'm sorry.
AFT, oh, no worries. It's relevant to the point. AFT, American Federation of Teachers, is one of the two large teachers unions in the country, the other being the National Education Association, which is actually by far the larger of the two. Now, Weingarten has positioned herself, though, as the face of teachers and teachers unions in America, primarily due to her long tenure as a union officer, as head of the AFT. The NEA, the National Education Association, has term limits for its officers. And so the current president, Becky Pringle, has been in that role for about 2 years, I believe. She'll be replaced by somebody else, a few years from now, and they cycle through. Pringle is actually a career teacher. Weingarten at AFT faces no term limits under the AFT bylaws and constitution, and she's been in a union leadership role for over a quarter century. The last time she set foot in the classroom was back in 1997. And so she taught part-time in New York City public schools, 2 hours a day as a per diem substitute from 1991 to 94, and then served as a regularly appointed teacher from 94 to 97. My guess is she actually started out as a union employee, as a union attorney for the New York City affiliate of the AFT in the late 80s, and became very close with the president of that local affiliate at the time. And my sense is, reading between the lines here, is that the outgoing president of that local union wanted Weingarten to succeed her. But to do that, Weingarten had to roll up her sleeves a little bit and spend at least a little time in the classroom.
A couple of hours a day as a per diem teacher. Is that what it was? A couple of hours a day?
Correct, for the first 3 years there, while she's still on staff at the union at the time. So anyway, she put in a little bit of time in New York City public schools, took over the New York City affiliate in 97, and then took over the national AFT in 2008.
And so
she's an attorney by trade and a union officer more than anything else.
I'm talking to Max Nelson, who's Director of Labor Policy at the Freedom Foundation. Why, you'd say, well, union's a private organization. Why does this bother anybody else? She is now credited with 11 and a half years of service, so-called, to the teachers' retirement system of New York City. She gets 11 and a half years of credit, having taught a couple of hours a day for 3 years, and she could get pension benefits on the basis of that?
That's exactly right, Lars. So the Freedom Foundation just put out a report today documenting this, and this is crazy stuff. You can't make it up. So as I mentioned a moment ago, she worked part-time in public schools for 3 years, full-time, I think, from what I can tell, for another 3 years. And as a public school teacher, she was paying, at least while she was working full-time, she was paying into the city-run, taxpayer-funded pension plan for New York City public school teachers. Now, from what I can calculate here, she would have accrued, based on her actual time worked as a teacher in New York City, she would have accrued a little over 4 years of service credit in the pension plan. Now, to become eligible for any benefits, to become vested in the plan, teachers have to work for 5 years, or they have to accrue 5 years of service credit. So she would have fallen short of vesting in the pension plan based solely on her classroom teaching experience. However, there's a provision in the union contract with the city that allows teachers to be placed on union leave if they're elected to serve as union officers.
Yep.
And that's exactly what happened when Weingarten was elected the head of UFT in 1997. And she's been on union leave. We verified this as part of our research. To this day, she's listed in the New York City public school system as an employee on union leave. And so documents that we obtained then from the retirement plan showed that she's been credited with 15 and a half years of service credit in the pension system, despite actually only working for 4 of those years. And so essentially what happened was the city retirement plan was counting her time as a full-time union officer, not working in the classroom, but head of the United Federation of Teachers in New York, was counting her time as the head of that union as though she was accruing service credit, just like a teacher working every day in and out in the classroom. And absent that counting toward her service credit, she wouldn't have been eligible for pension benefits at all.
So in other words,
as it is,
yeah.
So go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so she, as the top negotiator or the person who's head of the union, gets to benefit from the contract that she leads in negotiating.
Yes, correct. So whenever she decides to retire, she could retire now and be eligible for full pension benefits. She's 65. Let's say she retires 5 years from now at age 70, draws pension benefits for 15 years. Average life expectancy for a female in New York is about 85. So just very conservatively, if she draws pension benefits for 15 years after retiring at age 70, that would cost taxpayers well over $200,000, not taking into account cost of living adjustments that the pension plan provides, not taking into account a couple other factors. But for the pension plan counting her time out of the classroom as a union president, she wouldn't have been eligible for anything at all. But because of the sweetheart deal in the union contract, she could ultimately cost taxpayers several $100,000 in pension.
And let me ask you this, Max: is the New York teachers' pension well funded? Because I'm used to finding that almost every public pension in America is upside down. In some cases, literally hundreds of billions of dollars.
Well, I don't know that very many pension systems could be described, public pension systems could be described as well-funded. I couldn't give you, off the top of my head, a rundown on the status in New York. But it's certainly concerning from a taxpayer standpoint. Just to illustrate a little bit how crazy this is, when a New York City teacher is working full-time, they have to pay a certain percentage of their salary into the pension plan. No, it's a lot less than what the city has to pick up, what taxpayers have to pick up. But just based on the numbers that we have and her teaching record as we've been able to document it, Weingarten would have paid about $7,000 in wages based on the 6 years that she was employed part-time and then full-time.
Wow, 7,000 in, 200,000 out. That's Max Nelson, the Director of Labor Policy at the Freedom Foundation. Max, I appreciate you coming on. Back in a moment, we'll get to your calls. We'll talk about Joe Biden and what he says is the biggest threat in America, and you might be surprised by it. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to Lars Larson Show. I'm in favor of school choice, and to a large degree, I don't have a dog in the fight. I mean, I went to public schools, so did my wife. My adult kids went to public schools. It's not that I'm necessarily just in favor of alternatives. It's that I believe the only way to make something truly excellent is to have competition. And for the most part right now, in most American communities, if you move to a neighborhood and you say, well, what are my choices for where I can send my children to K through 12 public school or to school? And you'll be told by most people, well, if you live at that address, your kids go to that school. That's all the choice you get right now. And if you were to say, but isn't there an alternative place that I can send my children? And the answer you're going to get is no, you don't have an alternative place to send your kids. There should be, and it will do some good, not just for the private schools, the charter schools, the online schools, the virtual learning opportunities. It'll do some good for the public schools as well. Because when the public schools know that they can fail your kids to a large degree and that there is no consequence, that when they fail your kids, and according to the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, as many as 2/3 of the kids at grade 4 cannot learn proficiently. Now, I understand when parents say, well, when a kid gets to be a teenager, how do I keep them from skipping school? Well, I guess you raise them the right way so that they wouldn't dare skip school because they'll be in trouble with mom and dad. But at age 4 or 4th grade, you've got a 9-year-old kid. Mom and dad tell that 9-year-old, this is where you're going to school. You won't cut class. You will do your homework. Now, parents have a role in all that. But the public schools right now fail kids miserably. And what we're seeing right now is that charter schools, which operate as a public school, they're open to all. If there are too many kids who want to go to a given charter, they hold a lottery. And then in many cases, the charter school gets bigger and bigger. Same thing applies to the online learning schools. And yet, what happens is the public schools that are driven largely by the desires of the teachers' unions, they make the argument that if parents had any kind of choice to send their kids other than to the government-run failing public school, that this would hurt the public schools, as though competition hurts. Well, competition can hurt if you're doing a lousy job with the education of kids, and then some competition comes into the marketplace, and a bunch of your parents pull their kids out of your failing school and put them into a successful charter school. Yeah, you're going to lose the money, the federal money and the state money that would otherwise go to that public school. Isn't that the way it should work? Shouldn't the public schools have to say to themselves, we need to do a really good job? If we don't do a very good job, then we're going to lose the funding that goes with these kids. Well, consider this, though. Our friend Vince Bielski, who's at Real Clear Investigations, he's suggesting that with all the school choice that is now being delivered up in many communities, places like Arizona, where they've decided that they're going to offer parents the choice of taking their kids out of public school and taking a good chunk of the money that goes with them, anywhere from $7,000 to $10,000 in state funding every year to take your kids elsewhere. And that's also been imposed by 8 other states: Arizona, Florida, Indiana, West Virginia. They've all said, you want to have school choice? You want to take your kids somewhere other than the failing government schools? You're allowed to do it, and some of the money that the taxpayers have allocated to education, K through 12 education, will travel with your child to that school. Now, that makes sense. Now, the teachers' unions are screaming bloody murder because they say, well, if you do that, you might put the public schools out of business. I don't think it's actually that bad, but frankly, if they're failing your kids, they deserve to go out of business. If charter schools can decide, and I've got no dog in the fight for charter schools, I don't do commercials or ads for them, I just happen to believe in the concept that if you make a contract, and that's what a charter school is, the charter is a contract, and the charter school says, we will perform for the kids in the following way. The way you'd have a contract to put a new roof on your house, or buy a car, or take a job. Any of those contracts are legally enforceable. Do you know what the contract is with most government-run K through 12 public schools is? We'll take your money, we'll give your kid some education. If we fail your kid, we get paid anyway. Now, does anybody out there want to say they would sign up for a deal like that? But what Vince Bielski at Real Clear Investigations is arguing is that they may come on too fast. That if we have so much that has to be offered in choice, in school choice, that what's going to end up happening is you're going to end up having it expand so quickly that some of the failures are going to show up. He says the universal laws amount to a bracing change in school choice. Such programs have existed for decades, but until now, they've been limited to a narrow set of students, like kids from low-income families or in poorly performing public schools in need of special ed. By making all students eligible, regardless of their ability to pay for a private education, universal programs in those 8 states expand the possible pool of participants by about 4 million students. Now, that's a big change. That is a 40% increase in eligibility in just the last 2 years. That brings a total of 13.6 million students after the program start in just a couple of years. And school choice advocates are saying this is going to be great. The problem is when you have school choice and the parents do decide we're going to pull our kids out of a conventional government school and we're going to put them into an alternative, a private school, a charter school, an online school, or any of the other alternatives. They can be very, very creative. The problem is that if you expand very quickly, you have the possibility that you will have some failure. And when you have that failure, I don't want people to lose heart. In fact, one of the most common questions I get from parents who send me emails, and they say, I understood there was a charter school in our area and it failed. Doesn't that show that charter schools are a failure? And I answer back, no, failure is quite common in life. Let me point this out. The statistic from the business world is that 8 out of every 10 small business startups fail within the first 3 years. 8 out of 10. Now, you say, well, that shows that private business fails. You say, no, what it shows is that when you start a business, sometimes you're going to get it right, and sometimes you're not. When you start a public school that's funded by the taxpayers, you never fail. You always get the money. You always have the school. Nobody ever loses their job or their contract, even if you fail every single one of your customers. Do you know, there was a school, and this was in Texas, and we learned about this story about 2 weeks ago, where they canceled graduation. And why? Because the school only had 5 kids that were eligible for graduation. And I think at the end of the day, some of the teachers' unions are going to lose, but the kids ultimately will win. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.